Imagine waking up one morning and realizing you can't remember the last time you truly felt seen, not praised, not acknowledged, not liked, but seen in that raw, unfiltered way that pierces through the armor you've spent years building. You get up, wash your face, stare into the mirror, and for a brief moment the mask slips. There's a flicker in your eyes, something buried, something unspoken, and then it's gone. You put on your clothes, your practiced expressions, your tone, the version of you that the world accepts, and you step out into the storm, a storm no one else can hear. For many men, this storm never has a name. It moves silently beneath their smiles, their confidence, their humor, and their achievements. It builds behind the eyes, like a gathering pressure that no amount of distraction or success can fully silence. You might know this storm too. It's that sensation of being surrounded by people, yet feeling like no one could possibly understand what's really happening inside you. It's the unspoken questions that echo late at night when everything is quiet and your defenses are down. Questions like, if I showed my weakness, would anyone still respect me? If they knew what I truly feel, would they still stay? Am I protecting them, or just hiding from myself? Society teaches men to stand tall, to endure, to be the unwavering pillar. But no one teaches them what to do with the emotional earthquakes rumbling beneath that pillar. No one tells them that silence, if left too long, becomes a language of its own, one that can isolate even in a crowded room. Carl Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." But what happens when a man's unconscious isn't merely hidden? It's buried beneath years of cultural expectations, psychological defenses, and the quiet terror of vulnerability. What happens when strength becomes the very mask that suffocates the soul behind it? The paradox is haunting. Men are expected to be protectors, yet are rarely protected emotionally. They're told to be strong, yet never taught how to carry the unbearable. They're surrounded by people, yet starve for someone who can hear the silence. And so, they build internal fortresses, each brick laid with silent sacrifices, swallowed pain, unspoken fears, and carefully measured expressions. From the outside, it looks unshakable. From the inside, it's a pressure chamber with no release valve. Imagine standing at the edge of a storm, rain lashing, wind howling, yet everyone around you insists it's a clear, sunny day. You try to tell them about the storm, but their eyes glaze over. So you stop talking. You stop trying. You tell yourself, it's fine. I can handle it. And the storm grows louder. The truth is, many men live entire lives this way. They master the art of appearing fine. They become fluent in silence. And yet, in the moments between distractions, in the space between conversations, achievements, and obligations, there's a quiet ache. This ache doesn't scream. It whispers, and its whisper is devastating. No one will ever truly understand you. But what if that whisper isn't the truth? What if that storm inside isn't a sign of weakness, but a message you've been conditioned to ignore? What if everything you've been taught about strength, silence, and emotional control has unknowingly built a prison around your authentic self? Jung believed that every human carries a shadow, a part of themselves they refuse to acknowledge, yet which shapes their lives in invisible ways. For many men, this shadow isn't made of rage or sin, but of unexpressed sorrow, unmet needs, unclaimed vulnerability. The silent storm isn't just emotional turbulence, it's the unconscious crying out to be seen. And here lies the great question. If a man never allows the storm within him to be known, can he ever be truly loved? If he only shows the world the mask, can anyone ever touch the soul beneath it? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, does he even remember what that soul feels like anymore? These aren't just poetic musings. They are psychological fault lines, quietly shaping lives, relationships, identities. The longer they remain unacknowledged, the more distorted the sense of self becomes. Think of it this way. If you spend years pretending to be unshakable, what happens when you finally break? If you spend a lifetime hiding your storms, what happens when someone finally stands close enough to feel the wind? And if you've worn the mask for so long, who are you when it comes off? This is not a story of weakness. It's a story of silence. How it's built, how it seeps into the psyche, and how it shapes destinies without ever making a sound. Because beneath every composed face, there's a storm waiting to be understood, and the moment you stop pretending the sky is clear is the moment the real journey begins. The silent storm isn't random. It doesn't appear out of nowhere, nor does it fade simply with time. It is engineered, layer by layer, by forces so intimate, so invisible, that most men never even realize they're being shaped by them. From the moment a boy enters the world, he absorbs the subtle codes of his environment. He learns quickly which emotions bring comfort and which bring distance. When he cries as an infant, the response is immediate. But as he grows, that response changes. Be brave. Stop crying. Real men don't talk about their feelings. Don't be weak. The language is simple, but its psychological weight is immense. Each phrase doesn't just shape behavior, it etches itself into the unconscious, teaching him that certain emotions are acceptable, and others are dangerous. Carl Jung called this process the development of the persona, the social mask every individual constructs to navigate society. This mask is necessary to some degree. It allows us to function, to fit in, to survive within cultural systems. But when the persona becomes the only self a man shows, something far more dangerous occurs. The authentic self retreats into the shadows, becoming an exile within its own psyche. Jung warned that what is repressed doesn't disappear. It waits. It influences. It speaks through dreams, slips of the tongue, irrational fears, unexplained restlessness. It lives beneath the surface like tectonic plates shifting slowly, building pressure that eventually demands release. But why do so many men repress so deeply? Part of the answer lies in the collective psyche. Society has historically depended on male endurance, physically, emotionally, and mentally. Empires were built on the backs of men taught to silence their pain and keep moving forward. This archetype of the stoic, unbreakable man became idealized. Over centuries, it seeped into cultural narratives, parenting styles, religious teachings, and media portrayals. Look at modern storytelling. The hero is almost always the man who feels deeply but says little. His silence is revered, his endurance glorified. Vulnerability, if shown at all, must be brief, poetic, and redeemed by action. Anything more is portrayed as weakness. Arthur Schopenhauer once wrote that human beings are driven by a blind, relentless will, a force that pushes us forward even when we suffer. For men, this will often becomes fused with duty and identity. To deviate from this, to admit pain, doubt, or despair, feels like betraying something ancient and sacred, and so men internalize. They swallow their fears and dress them up as jokes. They mask their loneliness with ambition. They convert sadness into silent responsibility. Every feeling is filtered through a subconscious rulebook written long before they were born. This is the hidden architecture of the storm, childhood conditioning that teaches which parts of the self are welcome and which are banished. cultural mythology that glorifies the silent, enduring hero. Psychological defenses that form not out of choice, but out of survival. Over time, this architecture creates a split between the outer man and the inner man. The outer man is composed, rational, productive. He builds careers, provides for families, maintains order. Society rewards him. He feels validated by his competence, his ability to handle pressure, his silence. The inner man, however, is often a stranger even to himself. He holds the fears, the longings, the heartbreaks never fully processed. He remembers every moment he wanted to cry but didn't, every confession he almost made but swallowed, every time he felt invisible but laughed it off. Jean-Paul Sartre described this kind of existence as bad faith, a life lived according to external roles rather than authentic freedom. A man begins to identify so strongly with his outer roles, worker, protector, leader, provider, that he forgets there was ever anything else. But the unconscious does not forget. At night, when the world quiets, it whispers. It reminds him through sleeplessness, irritability, sudden waves of sadness he can't explain. He tells himself he's just tired. He blames work. He scrolls through his phone, numbing himself with endless noise. Anything to avoid listening to that voice. Because if he listens, he might have to face the truth, that beneath the persona lies a vast, neglected interior landscape, a wilderness of unacknowledged feelings. Viktor Frankl, who survived the horrors of the concentration camps, once observed that when we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. The storm inside a man cannot be fully blamed on culture or family or circumstance. There comes a point when he must confront his own inner architecture. But here's the catch. The longer the unconscious remains buried, the more unfamiliar it becomes. The man begins to fear what he might find if he looks inward. He worries that his emotions are too messy, too chaotic, too dangerous to face. So he builds more layers. He becomes hyper-competent, hyper-rational, emotionally distant, not because he feels nothing, but because he feels too much. Jung noted that neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. Many men carry subtle neuroses not because they are broken, but because they have avoided legitimate suffering for too long. The pain of acknowledging their storm seems unbearable, but the pain of silence corrodes them slowly. And so the hidden problem persists, not out of weakness but out of a tragic misunderstanding. They think silence protects them. In truth, silence isolates them from themselves. This is the invisible psychological engine beneath the storm, cultural scripts, repressed shadows, inherited myths. It operates quietly, but its influence shapes everything. Relationships, choices, self-worth, even how a man interprets love and meaning. And as the storm grows, it doesn't stay contained. It leaks into behaviors, into relationships, into the ways he responds to the world. The question is no longer just why the storm exists. The question becomes, what happens when it starts to shape reality itself, without him even realizing it? When a storm is left unacknowledged long enough, it doesn't simply remain inside, it starts to rewrite reality. A man who learns to hide his inner world begins, slowly and almost imperceptibly, to shape his outer world around that silence. He builds relationships, careers, and identities with a part of himself locked away, like constructing a house on shifting sand. Everything may look solid, but beneath the surface, instability grows. Consider this. When you've worn a mask for too long, People stop trying to see beneath it. They interact with the persona, not the person. Their love, their trust, their understanding. Everything is directed toward the version of you that you allow to be seen. And though this can create stability, it also creates a haunting disconnect. Late at night, a thought emerges like a cold whisper. Do they love me? Or the mask? This quiet doubt can corrode intimacy. Emotional walls, once built for protection, become invisible prisons. Relationships that should be places of refuge become stages for silent performances. The man listens to others but rarely speaks of his own fears. He gives advice but never asks for it. He becomes the rock for others while secretly sinking beneath his own weight. And those around him sense something is off, even if they can't articulate it. Partners may describe it as a distance, a wall, or a feeling that I can't fully reach him. Friends may say he seems fine but distant. It's not malice. It's not neglect. It's the quiet consequence of decades spent translating emotion into silence. Neurologically, this pattern has real consequences. The brain's limbic system, the emotional center, thrives on authentic expression and connection. When emotions are habitually suppressed, the amygdala, responsible for emotional intensity, doesn't simply shut down. Instead, it goes underground. Studies have shown that chronic emotional suppression increases physiological stress, elevates cortisol, and weakens immune response. Over time, this creates a baseline of quiet agitation. The mind is outwardly composed, but the body lives in a state of subtle tension, always bracing against something unnamed. Cognitively, this tension affects perception. When you bury your inner world, you become less attuned to the emotional signals of others. Empathy requires vulnerability. To feel deeply with someone, you must first feel deeply within yourself. Men who silence their storms often find themselves misunderstood, not because others fail to care, but because they've unconsciously trained themselves to misread emotional depth. This is how loneliness can exist even in loving relationships. A man can share a home, a bed, a life with someone, and still feel unseen. And then there are the subtle behavioral ripples. Some men become hyperachievers. They drown out the storm with endless work, goals, and external validation. Each accomplishment provides a temporary high, a momentary sense that the silence has been conquered. But when the applause fades, the storm is still there, waiting. Others retreat into isolation. They convince themselves that their inner world is a burden no one else could bear. So they stay quiet, keeping their pain neatly folded inside. Some become emotionally volatile, not because they're cruel, but because suppressed emotions leak out sideways. A minor comment turns into an argument. A small disappointment triggers disproportionate anger. Jung called this shadow projection, when the parts of ourselves we refuse to face are unconsciously cast onto others. The storm, denied a voice within, begins to speak through conflict without. There's also the existential cost. Jean-Paul Sartre described a concept called the gaze of the other. He suggested that much of human behavior is shaped by how we believe others perceive us. When a man builds his identity around being invulnerable, he starts to live constantly beneath this gaze, performing strength, competence, control, while neglecting the silent gaze within. This creates a strange kind of split consciousness. Outwardly, everything is functioning. Inwardly, he's drifting. The longer this continues, the harder it becomes to remember what genuine emotional connection feels like. Imagine living in a house where one room is always locked. You go about your daily life, eating, sleeping, talking, while pretending that room doesn't exist. But over the years, the locked door becomes impossible to ignore. You start to hear noises from the other side. You smell the air seeping out. You feel the drafts. The house is no longer fully yours. That locked room is the unacknowledged self. And here's the devastating irony. Many men only confront this room when something breaks. A relationship collapses. A career loses meaning. A health scare jolts them awake. These moments act as cracks in the facade, sudden lightning strikes that reveal the shape of the storm. Viktor Frankl observed that suffering, when left meaningless, leads to despair. But suffering, when confronted, can lead to transcendence. The unseen consequences of the silent storm are not just emotional, they're existential. If you live long enough with a storm inside, you risk mistaking the storm for the sky itself. You forget that there was ever a time when you felt whole, expressive, seen. You begin to believe that disconnection is normal, but it isn't. This quiet corrosion spreads not just through individuals, but through society. When millions of men live in silence, cultures are shaped by that silence. Leadership becomes more performative. Relationships become more guarded. Generations inherit the same storm, mistaking it for tradition. And so the cycle continues. The question becomes urgent now. What happens when a man decides, no more? What happens when he turns inward? Not to collapse, but to rebel against the silence that shaped him? Because rebellion, in this context, isn't loud. It isn't violent. It's intimate. It begins with a man daring to open the locked door. Every storm, no matter how long it has raged, carries within it the possibility of calm. But this calm doesn't come from denying the storm's existence. It begins the moment you decide to face it. And that decision is the quietest rebellion a man can make. For years, you've been trained to look outward for solutions. More achievements, more control, more distractions. But what if the path forward begins inward, not as a retreat, but as an act of radical courage? Carl Jung often said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Rebellion, in this context, means reclaiming the parts of yourself you exiled long ago. The frightened child, the quiet dreamer, the grieving soul, the voice that was silenced the first time someone told you to man up. This rebellion doesn't look like charging onto a battlefield. It looks like standing alone in front of the mirror and refusing to look away when your own eyes begin to tremble. It begins with awareness. The storm cannot be calmed if it remains unseen. The first act of rebellion is to name what has been nameless. To say, even if only to yourself, I feel lonely. I feel afraid. I am tired of pretending. These words may seem simple, but for many men, they are seismic. They shatter the illusion that strength is silence. They mark the moment when you stop performing and start existing. Awareness then leads to integration. Jung's concept of shadow work is not about destroying the shadow, but about integrating it, bringing the exiled parts of the psyche into conscious dialogue. When you acknowledge your fear, your sorrow, your vulnerability, you don't become weaker. You become whole. Imagine a storm cloud hovering over you for years. The moment you stop running from it, you realize that beneath the thunder lies rain, and rain nourishes. But integration requires courage. It means sitting in uncomfortable spaces without immediately fixing or escaping them. It means allowing tears you've long held back to finally fall. It means speaking truths that might make others uncomfortable, because they are the truths that make you real. Consider the story of Viktor Frankl. In the most dehumanizing conditions imaginable, he discovered that man's deepest freedom is the power to choose his response to suffering. Even when everything is stripped away, the inner stance remains. For a man facing his silent storm, rebellion begins when he chooses to stop numbing and start listening. Listening to his own silence. The next stage of rebellion is connection. The storm thrives in isolation. It weakens in communion. Finding one person, a friend, a mentor, a therapist, a partner, who can hold space without judgment is revolutionary. It's not about finding someone to fix you. It's about letting someone witness the parts of you you've hidden the longest. This is terrifying for many men, because vulnerability feels like handing someone the keys to your fortress. But in reality, true vulnerability doesn't weaken the walls. It opens the gates to genuine intimacy. Jean-Paul Sartre spoke of authenticity, the act of living not as a role, but as a self. When you allow someone to see your storm, you give them the chance to love you as you are, not as you pretend to be. And in that moment, the distance between souls begins to shrink. Rebellion also means redefining strength. For centuries, strength has been equated with silence, endurance, and control. But imagine a new definition. Strength is facing what you fear within yourself. Strength is choosing honesty over performance. Strength is holding your pain without letting it define you. Arthur Schopenhauer believed that suffering is inescapable, but meaning transforms it. When a man faces his storm, he doesn't eliminate suffering. He gives it form. He turns chaos into narrative, pain into wisdom, silence into dialogue. This isn't easy work. It's not meant to be. But every act of rebellion, no matter how small, begins to weaken the storm's hold. Journaling your honest thoughts without censorship. Speaking a truth to someone you trust. Admitting to yourself that the mask has grown too heavy. And then comes the most transformative act of rebellion. Forgiveness. Not forgiveness as an abstract virtue, but as a lived, personal revolution. Forgiving yourself for the years you stayed silent, for the moments you hid, for the times you didn't know how to speak. Jung said that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The rebellion isn't about becoming perfect. It's about becoming real. As you do this work, something extraordinary happens. The storm that once felt like an enemy begins to reveal itself as a messenger. It wasn't there to destroy you. It was trying to lead you back to the parts of yourself you abandoned. Your anger was pointing to your boundaries. Your sorrow was pointing to your unmet needs. Your loneliness was pointing to your longing for connection. Every wave, every gust of wind was a message in disguise. And when you finally start to hear those messages, the storm shifts. It doesn't disappear overnight, but it becomes something you can stand within, something you can understand. This rebellion doesn't make you less of a man. It makes you fully human. In a world where silence is inherited like a family heirloom, the man who chooses to face his storm becomes a living revolution. His presence ripples outward. His authenticity gives others permission to remove their masks too. It begins quietly, perhaps with a single whispered truth in the dark. But in time, that whisper becomes a voice. That voice becomes a roar. And that roar is not the sound of breaking, but of becoming. Imagine walking through a long corridor in your mind. Along the walls are paintings, moments from your life. Some are bright, full of laughter and connection. Others are darker, framed in silence. As you walk, you notice something unsettling. In every painting, there's a version of you, sometimes smiling, sometimes composed, sometimes indifferent, but never fully there. This is the moment most men never reach, the point where the rebellion against silence leads to the deepest realization. You were never the storm's prisoner. You were its creator, not consciously, not maliciously, but through years of survival, through the inheritance of cultural scripts, through the quiet fear of vulnerability. You shaped the walls that kept you apart from yourself. And here lies the ultimate paradox. The storm you feared was you, trying to return home. Carl Jung called this the process of individuation, the integration of all parts of the self, light and shadow, strength and weakness, persona and soul, into a unified whole. It is not about becoming someone new. It is about remembering who you have always been beneath the layers. Throughout life, men are told to find themselves. But the truth is far more profound. You don't find yourself. You face yourself. The mask, the persona, the silence, they were never your essence. They were survival tools, necessary at times. But tools are meant to be laid down when their work is done. The ultimate realization is this: true strength is not the absence of storms, but the ability to stand in the center of one and recognize it as your own sky. When you stop fearing the storm, you stop running from yourself. The silence that once suffocated you becomes spacious. You begin to hear your own voice beneath the noise. The boy you once were, the man you have become, and the soul you've ignored. They all begin to speak in harmony. Philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Viktor Frankl believed that meaning is not given, it's created. When a man stops living beneath the gaze of others, when he stops performing strength and starts being, he reclaims authorship of his life. You begin to see how every suppressed emotion was not an enemy, but a breadcrumb leading you back. The loneliness was never proof of your unworthiness. It was evidence of your depth. The fear of vulnerability was not weakness. It was the signal that your heart was still alive, waiting for you to knock on its door. The ultimate truth is devastating in its simplicity. No one else can give you the freedom you've been waiting for. Not love. Not success. Not approval. Those things can reflect your worth, but they cannot define it. For years, the world taught you to build fortresses, to stand tall, to speak less. But real liberation begins when you realize you can walk out of those walls any time. The key has always been in your pocket. This doesn't mean life becomes easy. The storm doesn't vanish, but it becomes familiar. And familiarity breeds understanding, not fear. Arthur Schopenhauer believed that most human suffering stems from resistance, the refusal to accept reality as it is. When you stop resisting your own inner landscape, you stop suffering in silence. You begin to live in truth, and living in truth changes everything. Imagine being in a relationship where you no longer hide behind strength, where your partner doesn't have to guess what's going on behind your eyes because you've learned to speak it. Imagine friendships where vulnerability isn't a confession, but a language. Imagine walking into a room and feeling no pressure to perform, because you finally made peace with the man beneath the mask. This is not a fantasy. This is what happens when a man integrates his storm. Jung often used the image of the self, not the ego, not the persona, but the totality of who you are. Most men live their lives orbiting their persona, mistaking it for their center. But when you return to the self, everything shifts. Decisions feel clearer. Relationships deepen. Purpose emerges not as a desperate search but as a quiet knowing. And the most profound part? You begin to see others differently too. When you faced your own storm, you start to recognize storms in others, not as threats, but as mirrors. You stop judging. You start listening. Your presence becomes grounding. Without even trying, you give permission for others to unmask as well. This is how change spreads, not through grand declarations, but through embodied truth. One man standing calmly in his storm can shift the emotional climate of everyone around him. The ultimate realization is that the storm was never meant to be conquered. It was meant to be understood. It's not your enemy. It's your compass. And as you stand in the center of that inner storm, you begin to feel something you may not have felt in years. Stillness. Not the stillness of emptiness, but the stillness of presence. This is the moment where the paintings on the corridor walls change. You look at them again, and this time you are fully there, in every frame. The boy who learned to hide, the man who wore the mask, and the soul who waited patiently. All standing together. The storm still moves. The winds still howl. But it no longer controls you. It is you. And you are vast enough to hold it. So here's the final truth, whispered from the depths of every man who has ever faced himself. The silence you feared was never empty. It was full of you, and once you hear that, you will never run from it again.